The role of the grandparents, and also it's their responsibility, is to share all of the teachings and the stories that were shared with them maybe at a very young age. And we're grandparents when it's time to share that knowledge, and how they would gather the grandchildren. It could be done in a circle, or maybe just sitting out on a land. And some of those stories I learned when we went berry picking with my grandmother. And when we'd sit there, that was a time of learning. And stories was how our way of life survived. And it was really important to preserve our way of life, our ceremonies, the practices, and most importantly, the language. Because a lot of our, even the ceremonies, is all in the language as well. And and how it was shared with me was, I would say, such a blessing to have gone through that part of my life where my grandparents and other elders had a very important role. And I would look at them as my mentors, my guides of all the things that I need to know. And because the language was never a written language, and how that was passed down from generation to generation, and even some of the stories probably go back 10,000 years or more. But remembering them is what's really important. And how you remember the stories that were shared, because there's so many stories and lessons that were shared with me. Having a good memory is also very, very important. But I'm going to tell a story about my Uncle Charlie, and this is what he shared with me a few years ago. He was raised by his uncle. And he said, as a young man, we're sitting on a hill, and his uncle shared many stories and shared a lot of information with him. And he said he must have spoke for about 2 hours. And then he got up and stood behind him and went through a ceremony where he put his hands on the top of his head and prayed for a long time. Then he walked clockwise and sat beside him again. And he asked him what just happened. He said, well, what I shared with you, all of that knowledge, in the future you're going to be asked some questions. And you have the answers. And the prayer that I shared with you, the ceremony, is so that you will remember everything that I've shared with you. And then he grew up and probably forgot a lot of the important things that were shared with him. Then a few years ago, I went to his house. I visit him quite often. And he said, guess what happened this week? There was a community gathering. And this man got up and he asked me those questions. And he said it was so overwhelming. He had to excuse himself, and he went outside and went through his own little ceremony. And he said, my mind went back to that day that we were sitting on that hill. And I remembered the ceremony, and I remembered what he had shared with me. He walked back in, and he asked him those questions, and he answered them. But the day that he was sitting on that hill, and the day that he was in that gathering, 75 years had passed, and he never wrote down anything. But it was the way that it was shared with him, where it was really important, all of the the values and how important that information was and how it was going to benefit the community was maybe how all of that came back. But this way of life has been ongoing for centuries, and how stories are shared. And the old people, when they say it's time to listen, they always pull their ears and they say, use these to listen to everything that they share, because they knew it was important. But it was the way it was shared, all of the lessons that you learned from the stories. They were teaching you to be a good person, to be respectful, to be kind, and to be generous. And also to always honor the Creator. I've been asked many times, how do you remember all of the stories and lessons that have been shared with you? I always go back to the source. Go back to the old people, my grandparents. And I would probably do the same thing as what Charlie did, would think about what they had shared. And at that moment, I'd be able to remember, based on all of the lessons that I learned from that story. And some I heard many times, that is okay if you hear it over and over again, because then you're going to remember that too. Storytelling is really important. It's not just sitting and telling a story, because a gathering is when people come together, and it also could be looked upon as a time of celebration because of the things that they do and how humor comes into the circle, and then how the stories are shared. Maybe there will be a feast. But sharing information the way that it was done in a way so that you can always remember events and special times in your life where you've heard a lot of these stories, and especially the lessons. But ceremony is never left out. It's always involved, even to begin a circle. Going through a ceremony just to ask for guidance. And that's really important, because you want to make sure that everything you share is accurate, the way it was shared with you. And some of the important lessons they would say is never add on, or never leave anything out. You say it the way it was shared with you. Sometimes maybe one story could have different versions based on who was telling and who was teaching, but that is okay, because basically all of the important messages are there. And that's why storytelling is really important. Storytelling is the time of when people come together. And those gatherings are so important because of what they share goes back centuries. Not necessarily to correct one another, but to ensure that all of the missing gaps or what is not shared would be told in that circle. And that's how they would complete a story, based on how it was shared with them and how they were sharing it with others. So that's why circles are so important. And this is where circles is a time that you can be heard, but also to listen, which was really important. My grandparents and other elders would say, just sit here, sit on the floor, and just listen. That's all you need to do. And so I was blessed to be around my grandparents and other elders that shared all of those wonderful stories and also memories. And that's what's shared today.